In this example, I want to go ahead and look at the concept of variable scope within JavaScript. So I'm going to create a new folder on the desktop, and that name of that folder will be variable scope. And I'm going to go ahead and open that folder in Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to start by creating an HTML file and a JavaScript file. So index.html, and I'll use that HTML5 template, title it variable scope. And then I want to reference a JavaScript file, so I'll have this reference to scope.js. And then I want to create that scope.js file. Okay, and really this is where I want to work. So in the window.onload, I'm going to have this function definition, and we can go from here. Okay, so if I create a variable inside of this function, so let the variable age equal to 30, this variable age is only accessible within this function. And what I mean by that is if I do a console.log of the age, I'm going to have no problem with that. Okay, so we should be able to see this working. I'm just going to go live to make sure that it is. And if I bring up my developer tools, sorry, not page source, I want to inspect. So I can bring up the developer tools, and you'll notice in this console.log, we're able to see the value 30 with no issue there. Okay, however, if I were to create another function, so I create a function called display age, and I do a console.log of the age, we're going to see that I have a problem as soon as I try to invoke that function. So if I try to invoke that function, then I have an issue. You'll notice that I'm getting an uncaught reference error, age is not defined. It's telling me on my JavaScript file on line 11, I have that issue. Line 11 is when I try to do this console.log age. And what's going on here is I have this variable age that I defined on line 4. That variable is accessible anywhere inside of this function. So inside of that function, that variable exists. Okay, and as long as it exists, I'm able to access it inside of that function. Okay, so it exists in the function. It actually exists everywhere, but it's accessible within that function. I'm able to access it. I'm able to assign a new value to it. I'm able to retrieve the value from it with no issues. However, as soon as I leave that function, so by invoking this function display age, I'm leaving this onload function. I'm leaving to go to the display age function. I jump into this block of code, and inside of that block of code, I have no variables defined. There is no concept of this variable age. The variable age exists still, but it's not accessible to me outside of my onload function. Okay, so the way I would define this, or the terminology that we'll use for this course, is this is a local variable. This variable is local to this function. It's not accessible outside of the function. If I want to change it, I want to make it a global variable. Okay, what I'm going to suggest doing is I want to declare a global variable, and the way I make a global variable in JavaScript is I define the variable outside of any other function. Okay, so I've defined the variable outside of my function. So I define the variable, I assign the value equal to 30. In the onload, I try to log it. In display age, I'm also trying to log it. But now I've declared the variable outside of any other function. Now you'll notice that I have no issues. I'm able to access that variable anywhere in that JavaScript file. It's accessible all the way throughout the file. Because it's defined outside of any other function, this is now a global variable. Okay, so let's say I have a conflict. So let's say I have another variable called age equal to 20. Okay, so now I have two variables, both named age. One has a value of 20, one has a value of 30, and I have a conflict. I have two variables with the exact same name. That's actually not a problem in JavaScript. You'll notice that I get the values 20 and 30. Okay, and let's work through that code. I've defined a variable inside of this onload function. I've assigned the value equal to 20, And because that's the most local variable, the scope is closest to where I'm trying to access it on line 5, that's the variable that's going to get used. So local variables, if they exist, will get used before global variables. Okay? So in this case, because I have this local variable, that's what I'm logging. However, when I go to the display age, I jump down to display age, there is no local variable called age in the display age function. And because there is no local variable, then I'm going to revert to the global variable, which has a value of 30, and that's what gets displayed there. So you'll see on line 5, we display the value 20. Then on line 6, we invoke this other function, display age. That's when we invoke our other function, and that's when we log our global variable value of age being the value of 30. Okay, and that's why we're getting those two different values. Okay, what I will suggest is we probably do not want a global variable. Okay, so let's say I make this a little bit more complicated. Let's say I want to, in my HTML, I want to add an input field where the user can type in some value and then click on a button that does some calculations. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to have a label for age, enter an age, and then an input field. With an ID equal to text. And I don't need a name. Okay, so I have that kind of HTML set up, and my JavaScript is set up. Okay, so this is what my HTML page looks like now. And what I want to do with that is in my HTML page, I want to run some kind of calculation. Okay, so my age, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I want to calculate maybe your birth year. Okay, and I'm going to make it super simple. So I have this button. I'm going to go ahead and calculate birth year. Okay, so this button, I'm going to set up that it has an on-click event handler, and it's going to run the calculate function. Okay, so I'm going to have a calculate function. Let's be detailed here, calculate birth year. Okay, so I have this button that's going to calculate the birth year. I suppose I should have a type equal to button, so it's not a submit button. Okay, so this is what my HTML page looks like. So if I enter 20, we want to calculate the birth year. And if I click on that, you'll notice that I get an issue because I don't have that function calculate birth year defined. Okay, so let's go ahead and define that calculate birth year. Okay, so here's my function, calculate birth year. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to first maybe have a function to get the current age, right? So I'm going to have a function retrieve age. Okay, and the way I'm going to handle retrieving the age is I'm going to have a variable called age, and then I'm going to assign the value of age to document.getElementById, by ID, and then I asked the user what their age was, and I'm grabbing the corresponding value that they entered. Okay, and that's the value that they've typed into this input field. And if I'm looking on here, it would be the value 20. They've typed that in. So when I calculate the birth year, I want to first retrieve the user entered value for whatever they typed into this text field. So I have that function right here. Okay. So I have this age, and some of you might be thinking, well, I'm going to need that age in calculate birth year, right? That's going to, and I'm also going to need maybe to have that age in the display age. So maybe it makes more sense to not define this variable age here, but to make it a global variable so that I can use it in multiple places. And I've suggested that maybe we don't want to use global variables. The rule of thumb is I want to keep scope as local as possible. So if I can avoid it, I'm going to avoid using global variables. I could actually make it work using global variables, but it's a bad coding practice. Okay, we want to get out of the habit of using global variables. So let's just say I want to do all of these things though. I want to retrieve the age, I want to calculate the birth year, and then I want to display the age, and maybe I want to have another function display the birth year. Okay, I want to do all of those things. Okay, so another way to do this instead of using global variables is when they click on the button, we're going to calculate the birth year. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to need to retrieve the age. So we have a variable here that we're going to create a local variable for, and it's going to go get the user entered value. And instead of having that stored in a global variable, what we're going to do is we're going to return the value of that variable. Okay, so we're going to return the age that the user typed in. Okay, so now up in calculate birth year, that gets triggered when the user clicks on the button. So they type in 20. Now when they click on this button, that's going to trigger this calculate birth year. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have another variable called age. It's going to invoke that function. Okay, so I have this variable age that's going to call that function, and it's going to run all of this code. So it's going to determine what the user entered, and it's going to return that value. That return value is then going to get stored in this other local variable called age. Okay, so I didn't have to have a global variable to have these two functions both have a reference to the value that the user typed in. And some of you might be thinking, but you have two local variables. You could have had just one global variable. Two local variables is much better than one global variable. Okay, this is very preferable to having one global variable. And the reason I'm going to tell you why is because if I have one global variable, and let's say that value is not what I expect, so let's say my code is messed up in some way and that the value of this variable is not what I expect. Okay, if I have a local variable, I know that it's screwed up somewhere in this block of code. If I have a global variable, now I have to look through the entire file because I don't know where it got messed up. Okay, that's really the determining factor, is how much code do I actually have to debug? Okay, so we have this calculate birth year. We're determining what the user entered, and let's just go, our birth year is just going to be 2020 minus the age. Okay, so it's not the correct calculation, but it really doesn't matter. Okay, and then I want to call display age. Okay, and I don't want to pass in the birth year. I want to pass the age. Okay, so whatever the age that we've retrieved, I'm going to go ahead and pass that over to display age. I'll have another variable that gets passed in called age, and I can log it. So whatever gets passed in, that's what I'm going to log. And then I'm going to have one more display function. Okay, and I'm just going to log the birth year. Okay, so now I have to pass along the birth year, and life is all set. Okay, so I have no global variables. You'll see that age gets logged from our initial onload function. So if I go ahead and run this, you'll see age gets loaded from the onload function. But now if I say my age is 30, I can calculate the age and the birth year. If I say 40, every time I click that button, I'm going to output the current age and then the birth year. If I say 50, so every time I click that button, I'm going to log two different values. And I'm doing that with no global variables. So the ideal situation is I have local variables in all of my functions, and I avoid global variables for the most part. I say I avoid global variables for the most part. If you remember back to when we were talking about data types, a function can be a data type. Well, this is where things get tricky. A function can be a data type, so for instance, line 7, display age is actually a variable that is a function. Okay, so another way to write this display age might be to say, here's a constant called display age that's equal to some function definition that takes in a variable called age. Okay, so that's a different way to write a function definition in JavaScript. It just becomes a constant or a variable. And then the scope of this function definition, since it's not defined in any other function, the scope of that function actually becomes a global function. Okay, so it gets a little bit tricky. We can also do that with display birth year. So with display birth year, we can say const display birth year is equal to a function that takes in one parameter. We can do the same thing with calculate birth year. We can say const calculate birth year is equal to a function. And we can do the same thing with retrieve age. We can say const retrieve age is equal to a function that takes no parameters. So just a different way to write function definitions in JavaScript. Functions are just variables, so we can write them differently, and you'll notice that this is working the exact same way that it was before. Okay, so it's working perfectly fine, exactly as it was before. We've just changed how we've defined our function definitions. Now, you might have noticed we changed our function definitions so that they look like constants or variables. I use that term interchangeably. We've changed them to be constants as opposed to just a function definition. And because we see them now written differently, because they're a constant or a variable, and they're not defined in any other function, we have global variables, if you will. Our functions are global variables that can be invoked anywhere within this file. Okay, so that's typically the one exception that you'll have. Most of the time you do not want global variables, with the one exception of most of the time your function definitions tend to be global variables in JavaScript until you get a little bit more organized and maybe use a JavaScript library. But until that point, your JavaScript functions are typically global variables. Okay. So scope is super important in JavaScript. We really only have two scopes. We have a local variable that's defined inside of a function and a global variable that's defined outside of any other function. Other languages have other scopes like private and public and protected. JavaScript does not. They have local variables and global variables. Okay, and those are the only two scopes that you're going to deal with in this class.